Svein Holsether, the president and chief executive officer of Yara International, one of the biggest fertilizer firms, has said that Vladimir Putin is weaponizing food, and the impact is being felt around the world. What is Putin's secret plan? How is Putin weaponizing food after its invasion of Ukraine? Hold on to your seats as we dive in for answers through this video. Russia is the world's biggest exporter of fertilizers, but its war with Ukraine has disrupted shipping and increased prices for natural gas, which is an essential ingredient in fertilizer manufacturing. This has forced farmers to increase food prices, putting immense pressure on consumers worldwide. The EU first launched sanctions against Russia in February, but exemptions were made for food and fertilizer. The managing director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, has warned that the fertilizer prices remain very high and production of ammonia, which is used to make fertilizer, has shrunk dramatically. This is likely to lead to food production and food prices in 2023. Georgieva connected the issue to Russia's war on gas prices and gas availability, noting that Russia stockpiled fertilizer for domestic use last year. And while its exports declined, the record prices paid for fertilizer led to a 70% increase in export revenues. The country also increased exports to countries such as India and Turkey, and produces large amounts of key fertilizer ingredients like potash and phosphate. The president of Yara, a global fertilizer firm, said the dependency on Russian fertilizer is a powerful weapon, and called for a reduction in dependency on Russia to avoid this being used as a weapon in war. It was also pointed out that half the world's food production is dependent on fertilizer. The reason the cost of fertilizers has been on the rise in recent years is due to a variety of factors, including a demand for food worldwide, the rising cost of raw materials, and increased regulation of the industry. Additionally, agricultural sanctions imposed by Russia and other countries, such as the United States and the European Union, have contributed to the increase in fertilizer costs. These sanctions were put in place as a response to Russia's actions in Ukraine and have limited the ability of Russian farmers to access international markets and modern agricultural technology. As a result, Russian farmers have had to rely more heavily on domestic fertilizer production, which has driven up prices and reduced availability. Severe impacts. Recently, economists have reported that there have been a sharp increase in fertilizer costs. This could quite possibly lower food production yields so much by the end of the decade an increase in agricultural land equivalent to the size of much of Western Europe would be required to meet the demand globally. This would mean that severe impacts for deforestation, biodiversity, and carbon emissions they added. Dr. Peter Alexander from the School of Geosciences commented that this could probably be the end of the era of cheap food. And while it would affect everyone, it would hit first and probably hardest in the poorest people of society, who are already struggling to afford enough healthy food as it is. With the sustained increase of fertilizer prices, the food prices could possibly increase by an incredible 74% by the end of this year, the study calculated, raising fears of up to 1 million additional deaths and more than 100 million people being undernourished if high fertilizer prices continue the same way. Yara's boss, Mr. Holsether, warned that the impact of all this is being felt around the world. The EU had resolved a hostile situation by agreeing to ease curbs on Russian fertilizer exports as a part of a new sanctions package, which drew a rebuke from the Ukraine. The hostility had pitted Western Europeans who were calling to loosen restrictions on Russian fertilizer exports against the Eastern Caucasus led by Poland. As Poland wanted to maintain the existing blockade, it was only resolved after EU leaders meeting for a summit in Brussels sent an issue back to the ambassadors to break the deadlock. The two sides had been at odds over whether existing sanctions, and this makes it too difficult to supply fertilizers to third countries, increasing the danger of famine in Africa at a time when Russia's war on Ukraine has already disrupted global food supplies. On the other side, 4 Eastern member countries that warned that a greater leeway would effectively bail out President Vladimir Putin and the oligarchs who own Russia's fertilizer industry, enabling Russia continue funding its war of aggression on Ukraine. The deal. The EU had resolved this issue in a classic European compromise that would take effect if no EU members objected by Friday lunchtime. The change in the relaxation of the agricultural cargo would be made limited and specific, which was a key point that Poland and the Baltic countries were rooting for. The group of Western countries was happy that there was now more clarity. Ukraine was furious. The efforts to exempt Russian oligarchs and businesses from the EU sanctions are currently in place. It deals a significant blow to the effectiveness of the sanctions regime, says Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba. It has been further added that these attempts also weaken support for Ukraine and hinder the joint effort to stop Putin's aggression. Kuleba states that Ukraine strongly opposes these efforts and expresses gratitude towards EU members who also oppose them. Both Russia and Western European leaders say that their goal is to save Africa from famine. And while it's clearly evident that these sanctions are hurting African food security, fixing the global fertilizer crunch would not solve a crisis that long predates the war in Ukraine and is caused by many more factors. It would, however, open up Russia's fertilizer export markets and lower the prices for Western European farmers. The beginning of the sanctions. Since the EU had first launched sanctions against Russia in February, exemptions have been carved out for both food and fertilizer. Russia argues that these sanctions are particularly targeting individual oligarchs, such as the ammonia baron Dmitry Mazepin. They have also brought up Russia's main agricultural banks, preventing the country from exporting fertilizer as well as ammonia needed to make it. This was a stumbling block that nearly saw Russia pull out of the UN-brokered deal allowing Ukrainian grain to be exported from the Black Sea ports. Ports in the Netherlands, Belgium, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania have also become congested with Russian fertilizer cargoes. And while the EU sanctions do not target agriculture, they've created a sense of legal uncertainty. The Western and Russian diplomats have commented that this is making it harder for Russian companies to access funds to cover transport costs and turning European operators skittish about engaging with blacklisted entities. Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki of Poland urged EU member states to strengthen and prolong sanctions as he arrived at the summit. President Gitanas Nausėda of Lithuania stated food security should not be used as an excuse to ease sanctions while Ukrainian civilians are being killed by Russian bombs. The spread of hunger. More than 145 million Africans are currently going hungry, the Red Cross estimates. Some 26 million in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia face acute food insecurity, and the number is rising. Russia's narrative that they are issuing publicly is that the reason for this massive spike in hunger is mainly because of the EU sanctions. The notion has taken hold in many parts of the continent, and it's not all fiction. Fertilizer shortages and rising prices as a result of Russian supplies being held up in European ports, this has a direct impact on African food production. And some countries rely to a large extent on Russian exports. Before the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, around 40% of Ghana's fertilizer stocks came from Russia. Fertilizer prices have risen by 199% since May of 2020, according to the UN's World Food Program, and fertilizer shortages are estimated to have cut this year's global production of maize, rice, soybean, and wheat by 2.4%. In May, the president of the African Development Bank, Akawumi Adesina, warned that if steps were not taken to address the shortage of fertilizers, Africa could see a reduction of 20% or more in food production. However, that overestimates the risks by a large margin, according to David Laborde Dubeke, a senior research fellow in the Markets, Trade, and Institutions Division at the International Food Policy Institute. Although rising prices will lead to fertilizer shortages globally and maybe more in Africa. Only around 4% of Russia's fertilizer exports went to Africa before the war, he pointed out. And while EU sanctions contribute to Africa's food insecurity, they are only a small part of a much bigger picture. Strengthening exemptions for Russian fertilizer and food exports won't make as much difference in Africa as the Western European governments. That being said, the Eastern Bloc is also over-exaggerating the importance of these exemptions. The fertilizer and food exports only earn a small share of Russia's export revenue, and they're controlled by only a handful of oligarchs. So while freeing up the flow of agrochemical products might be of the interest of a narrow group of people, it wouldn't change the position of Russia on anything by allowing more or less of these trades. And in fact, Russia's fertilizer industry might not be hurting all that much either. While export volumes have been down 10% compared to last year, the profits of Russian manufacturers, propped up by higher prices, have remained largely unscathed, according to the county officials. Let us know what you think by commenting below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and smash the bell icon too to stay updated on all new videos.